All right, let's talk about the Greek period. In our previous video, we talked about the Persian period. This is the final period of the Old Testament. And now let's slide down the Bible timeline and let's look at what happens between the end of the Old Testament, which was during the Medo-Persian period, and the Roman period, which is where the New Testament takes place. So the first thing we need to understand is that the Greek period followed the period of the Medes and the Persians. And so the Greek period kind of encompasses three sub-periods. That red line there, you can see that there were three periods that make up what we call the Greek period between 334 and 166 BC. So let's talk about these three sections within the Greek period. So the first one was the conquest of Alexander the Great from 334 to 323 BC. This was basically 13 years where Alexander the Great conquered every world superpower, including Syria, Egypt, Persia, and Babylon. So this was an incredible feat of military conquering, because in 13 years, Alexander the Great essentially conquered the known world. So this map comes from the Four Portraits book. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see the vast expanse that Alexander the Great was able to conquer in a very short period of time. He is, of course, known as one of the most accomplished military leaders of all time. You can see just as we span across the incredible amount of land that he was able to conquer in just a very short period of time, from all the way from Macedonia down to Egypt, all the way across Asia Minor, Syria, Persia, and all the way even to India. So Alexander the Great's conquests were significant for a number of reasons, but when it comes to the study of the New Testament and the Gospels, one of the most important reasons, as we get from this quote, was this. It says, while Alexander Swift's conquest proved his military genius, his most influential role in history is his promotion of the process of Hellenization. Hellas, the word, means Greece, and Hellenization refers to the spread of Greek language and culture. So Alexander the Great was a great military leader, but he also spread Greek culture passionately. So this 13-year period of time was very, very important, because Alexander the Great was basically Greekifying the world. Alexander the Great was essentially turning the whole world Greek. So because he was a passionate believer of Greek philosophy, Greek culture, so that included things like gyms, public baths, everything we think about Greek culture, even the language and the religion, the Greek gods, all of that Alexander the Great was known for spreading. Now, the Jews did not oppose him militarily, and so he allowed them to worship in their temple as they wished without persecution. So the Jews were not a problem for him. And so even though he was spreading Greek culture, he was not forcing them, he was not assimilating them. He allowed the Jews to continue to worship however they want. However, Greek culture was everywhere, and the Jews could not avoid it. They could not go anywhere without being encountered with Greek culture, statues, architecture, language, and philosophy. It was everywhere around them. And this is important because some of the Jews began to embrace Greek life, but others did not. They really saw it as paganism, and they rejected it thoroughly. So this Hellenization of the world caused a rift between the Jewish people. So this is important to understand about Alexander the Great's influence. So that's the first section, the conquest of Alexander the Great. The second part of the Greek period is what's known as the Ptolemaic Empire. And this went from 323 to 198 BC. So here's what happened. So when Alexander suddenly died at the age of 33, and we don't really know exactly why, a power struggle emerged among his generals over the vast amount of land that he had conquered. And what happened was that eventually two dynasties emerged, and they were called the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty, or the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. And what's interesting is that Israel, or Palestine, was caught right in between them. So this is a map that we can see of where these dynasties kind of took place. You can see the Ptolemies centered down in Alexandria in Egypt. You have Palestine right there in the middle, and you have the Seleucid Empire up there in Syria in the north. You can zoom in a little bit. You can kind of see some of the towns and some of the key places that were part of this time period, because it's very important to realize that Israel was right in the middle of these two warring empires during the time of Greek dominance. And it matters because at first, the Ptolemies had control over Palestine, and later the Seleucids took control over it. So let's talk about that first period, the period of Ptolemaic dominance, okay? So we're in the second section of our Greek period. And Israel had a relative amount of peace during this time. This was a good time for Israel. But one of the important things that we want to keep in mind when it comes to the Gospels and the Bible is that Alexandria, Egypt started to become a major center of academia. And what also happened was that during this 125-year time of Ptolemaic dominance, Jews pretty much stopped speaking Hebrew. And of course, the Old Testament being written in Hebrew, this was a very significant shift for the Jewish people. Many Jews were still faithful Jews, but they only spoke Greek. So let me pull up a quote that I thought was great during this time. It says, during this time, Alexandria, Egypt, the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire, developed into a major center of scholarship and learning. A vibrant Greek-speaking Jewish community flourished there. However, since most Jews no longer spoke or read Hebrew, the need arose for a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. One of the most significant literary achievements of this period was the translation of the Septuagint, which is abbreviated LXX. It is the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament. The Septuagint became the primary Bible of both Jews of the diaspora and of the early Christians. Of course, diaspora meaning dispersion, and what that refers to is that the Jews who were not living in Israel, but they were Jews who were dispersed throughout the rest of the Mediterranean world. So this Ptolemaic period during the Greek period of world history was very important for the development of the Jewish people, especially because the Septuagint was created, and of course, this became the primary Bible of the New Testament years of ministry. So a very, very significant development when it came to the setting that we're going to see of the New Testament world. So we started with Alexander the Great. Now we talked about the Ptolemaic Empire, but eventually the Seleucid Empire overtook the Ptolemies. So during this time, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were constantly battling, but in 198, the Seleucids took dominance over Israel. So let's look at this period briefly. So if we look at the map again, we can see right there again that Israel is kind of caught between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. War and strife constantly raged between them. But in 198, the Seleucids finally took control over Israel. But right around that time, there was a new threat that began to start looming, and that was the threat of Rome. So the general of the Seleucids, Antiochus III, he was the leader of the Seleucid armies. He responds to this new Roman threat by attacking Rome, but he's defeated. Now here, after this, what happens is Antiochus III, he's defeated. He returns to Syria, but his son, Antiochus IV, is taken prisoner in Rome for 14 years. So when he is released, this person, Antiochus IV, he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. And what this means was manifest one, or God revealed. And this person, this guy, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, becomes one of the greatest threats that Israel has ever known. And so what we want to do is we want to pause between looking at the world empires, and in our next lesson, we need to take a look at why he is so important. So in our next video, what we want to do is just take a brief look at Antiochus Epiphanes and his significant role in the history of the Jews.